Let me start recording. So I can go ahead and start the blood, even though you guys, that's going to be on the next exam, and many of you are still working on this exam, which is fine. So the next several chapters have to do with the blood. Have to do with the blood and the heart and the cardiovascular system, right? And so one of the things that you'll notice is that in Pearson, I made the homework assignments for this. I made the cardiovascular system. So I kind of lumped together chapters 11, 12, and 13. And it's a longer homework assignment than normal, but you have longer to do it. You have a few weeks to do it. So because these are so closely related, right? The blood, the heart, and the blood vessels are all closely related. I lumped them into one category called the cardiovascular system. Okay, so we have to start off talking about the blood, right? The main purpose of the blood is to carry around nutrients, right? Especially oxygen, carbon dioxide. We'll see that the red blood cells mainly carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. You also have white blood cells in the body. What do white blood cells do?
They
The white blood cells?
White bloods. I don't know if Peter froze up there, maybe. The white blood cells defend your body against infection, right? So we have red blood cells carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide, white blood cells defending against infection. And there are these chemical messengers floating around too. We'll talk about the endocrine system, or we did just talk about the endocrine system. Those hormones are getting through your body in your bloodstream. So here are all the functions of the blood, right? It's transporting all these things through the blood, gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients from what you eat, like carbohydrates and amino acids, hormones, which we talked about in the endocrine system, and even metabolic waste. So when you digest foods, there are certain waste products that go through your bloodstream so that you can get them out of your body. This regulates a lot of your, what your blood does is regulate the pH and the ion composition of interstitial fluid. So we'll see there's carbon dioxide dissolved in your blood that regulates pH. There is the restriction of fluid loss at an injury site. There's blood clotting, right? That's to prevent you from losing blood at an injury. White blood cells are number 4. They defend against pathogens. And number 5, it stabilizes body temperature, right? A lot of people don't think about that, but if you have poor circulation, what happens is that the blood does not circulate often enough from like your fingertips back to your core, back out to your fingertips. And so people with poor circulation often have cold fingers and toes. It's a condition called Raynaud syndrome. And it's due to the fact that their blood doesn't go to their core and back out a lot. The blood at your core is hot. It's 98.6 at your core, right? So it's taking that temperature and bringing it out to your extremities. So what's the blood made of? Well, you can divide the blood into plasma and formed elements. The plasma is the liquid part of the blood. The formed elements are the solids. There is a slightly more than half of your blood by volume is plasma. So about 55% is plasma, is liquid. And about 45% are the solids, the formed elements. So those are the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. We'll talk about each of those. The blood volume varies by body size, but on average, males have 5 or 6 liters, females have 4 to 5 liters. So, about 5 liters, about 10 pints of blood is normally what you have, 10 or 12 pints. Now, on average, why do you think males have more volume than females of blood?
Because of the body mass? Maybe?
Yeah, just because their body mass. Just because on average, the male body mass is bigger. Right, so they have to be able to transport more oxygen and things like that. Characteristics of blood, it is just above, a little bit above body temperature. Body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, so blood's about 38 degrees Celsius. It is more viscous than water, so it's not, you couldn't pour it like water. It's more like honey, like it's thick. Its pH is a little bit on the alkaline side, a little bit basic, so 7.35 to 7.45. And it is a type of connective tissue. It's a unique tissue. It's the only connective tissue that is made of liquid, right? It's only connective tissue that has a liquid matrix to it. Oftentimes when you go to a doctor or you go to a hospital, they want to collect the blood so they can do an analysis of it. That procedure is called venipuncture. It's usually taken from your veins. They put a needle in your veins, right? And they pull blood out. The reason they usually use veins, and they usually use the median cubital vein, which is on the inside of your elbow, is that the veins are closer to the surface. They're more superficial and they have thinner walls. We'll see the arteries have thicker walls, so they're harder to get to. Veins also have lower blood pressure, so it's a little bit easier. They're not spurting the blood out. Right. All right. So we'll talk about these components of the blood, and we'll start talking about the plasma, right? And then we'll switch to talking about the formed elements. Remember, the plasma is the liquid part of the blood. So what's in that liquid? Well, mostly it's water, right? 92% of your plasma is water. About 7% are proteins that are dissolved, and about 1% are things like hormones and nutrients that are dissolved in there as well. So water is just water. We know what that is. Well, what types of proteins are dissolved in the plasma? These are the three major types of proteins that are found there. The most abundant are called albumins. Albumins are just there to maintain osmotic pressure of the plasma. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there is some pressure of the liquid part of the blood, the plasma, and there is some pressure within each red blood cell. You want that pressure to be about equal, right? You don't want that pressure pushing in on the red blood cell. You don't want the pressure of the red blood cell pushing out. So in order to keep that even, there are albumins that are dissolved in the plasma. The second most common type of plasma proteins are globulins. Globulins are antibodies. Antibodies are a type of globulin, and that's most of what the globulins are in the blood are antibodies. They're made by B cells. They're involved in immunity. We'll see that. And then also in the plasma are these proteins called fibrinogen. And fibrinogen gets converted to fibrin, and that's involved in blood clotting. So that's really important to create clots. Whenever there's any kind of an injury to a blood vessel, your body's going to create a clot so that you don't lose too much blood. Other things that are dissolved in the plasma. So those were the 7% that are proteins, right? And then we said there's about 1% other things dissolved. Well, there are nutrients dissolved. So nutrients are things that come primarily from what we eat. So lipids, carbohydrates, amino acids, vitamins, right? Things that are used for cell growth, for cell maintenance. Electrolytes. Electrolytes are just ions, right? So sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, those are all just ions that are dissolved in the plasma. And organic wastes. Organic wastes come from the breakdown of certain foods that we eat. So they include urea, uric acid, creatinine, bilirubin, and ammonium ions. We'll see in the digestive system that when you break certain things down, you create some of these waste products. They are transported through your blood to get to your kidneys, right? And your kidneys get them to your bladder so that you can get rid of them. So that's the plasma. That's the liquid part of the blood. What about the formed elements? The formed elements are the solids. So red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So we'll talk about red blood cells first. And most of the formed elements are red blood cells. If you take a sample of blood from somebody and you look at it under a microscope, it's going to be mostly red blood cells. You'll see very few white blood cells. Red blood cells contain a red pigment called hemoglobin, and they are there to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. The red blood cells are responsible for the red color of blood. And about 1/3 of all cells in your body are red blood cells. So you have a huge number of red blood cells. And the doctors can do a red blood cell count to see if you have, somewhere in the average range or too many or too few. If you have too many or too few, those are indications that you have certain disorders. And so what they measure it as are how many cells you have per microliter. And so they can actually just take a sample. They know how many, how big that sample is. They can estimate how many cells are in that sample. They can also do this type of measurement as something called the hematocrit. And what they do with a hematocrit is they draw blood, they put it in a tube, they take that tube and they put it in a machine called the centrifuge, which spins the tube really fast. When you spin that tube really fast, the heavier things sink to the bottom and the lighter things go to the top. And so what's sinking to the bottom are actually the red blood cells. They're packing down to the bottom and sinking to the bottom. And they measure, they take that tube, let me see if I don't have a picture. They take that tube and they measure from the bottom of that tube to the top of the red blood cells, what's that number? And then from the bottom of the tube to the top of the blood, the liquid. And they see what percentage of the entire amount is red blood cells. Now it's usually somewhere around 45%, right? 46% for men, 42% for women. So if it's only 38%, that's a problem. If it's 60%, that's a problem, right? So that's just another way of measuring and getting an estimate of how many red blood cells you have. They are specialized to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide efficiently. They have a unique shape among cells. They're called a biconcave shape. It means that they kind of look like a donut, but the hole is not all the way through the middle. It's just kind of an indentation. What this allows for is there's a huge surface to volume ratio, right? There's a lot of surface area, and that allows for them to bind to many multiple molecules of oxygen at the same time. It also allows them to be flexible so that they can fit through capillaries. Capillaries are really small blood vessels. As these red blood cells go from, first being formed until they're actually mature red blood cells, they lose most of their organelles. So as mature red blood cells, they don't have organelles. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have mitochondria. They don't have ER, any of those things, right? Those are all gone. And the reason that those are gone is that they use the room that those would take up to bind to more oxygen molecules. So here's a few different things. Over on the left is what's called a blood smear. If you just took blood from somebody, a blood sample from somebody, put a drop on a slide, and you literally take a second slide and you stand it up and you smear it across that first slide, it creates a blood smear. If you look at that under a microscope, most of what you'll see are red blood cells, right? And you don't even see any white blood cells in this particular one. Over here in B, you actually have a micrograph. These are what the red blood cells look like. So using a scanning electron microscope, they can see exactly what these blood cells look like. And here's a drawing, a recreation of one of the red blood cells. You don't have to know the size, right? The numbers. I don't want you to know the numbers, but understand what the biconcave shape is and know that the red blood cells are that size and that shape in order to efficiently bind to oxygen, right? So you don't have to know these numbers or anything like that. Okay, hemoglobin accounts for over 95% of all the red blood cell intracellular proteins. It's composed of 2 pairs of globular proteins called subunits. Each subunit contains heme with an iron atom, and they transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. So red blood cells are bound to this protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin binds to iron, iron binds to oxygen. That's kind of the relationship of it. The oxygen binding to hemoglobin, it's pretty weak. If there is a high plasma oxygen concentration, the hemoglobin gains oxygen until it's saturated. So this is what occurs in your lungs, right? In the capillaries of your lungs, you have a lot of oxygen. And so you want that oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin. If you have a low plasma oxygen concentration and high CO2, the hemoglobin releases oxygen and it would rather bind to CO2. And this is what happens when the blood circulates to the different systems of the body. Your blood is going to give up oxygen in your muscles. Then it's going to circle back around to your lungs and pick up another oxygen, circle around to your muscles and give up that oxygen. It's just going to shuttle it back and forth. And it's the hemoglobin that the oxygen is actually binding to. So one of the disorders that's common is something called anemia. Anemia is when you have a reduction in the blood's oxygen carrying capacity. So most of us associate anemia with low iron. Remember, the red blood cells are bound to hemoglobin, which binds to iron, which is how oxygen binds to them. If you have low iron, you're going to have low oxygen binding. So that is one type of anemia, right? But there are other types of anemia. And anemia just means that the red blood cells are not efficiently binding oxygen, right? Or it could be that you don't have enough red blood cells. And the symptoms are going to be things like muscle fatigue and weakness. And that's because anemia, or because oxygen is used for ATP. Oxygen is used to make energy. So if you don't have enough oxygen carrying capacity, your muscles are going to get tired easier and they're going to be weaker. So red blood cells, they do have a lifespan, they do wear out especially because they don't have any organelles, right? They can't make any new proteins, they can't make any energy. And so as they keep circulating through your blood vessels, there's damage, there's wear and tear on them. And their lifespan is about 120 days. So about four months, they get taken out of circulation. So about 1% of all your red blood cells are replaced every day. So each day we're making new red blood cells and putting them into circulation. And about 3 million new red blood cells enter per second. So who could tell me where we make our red blood cells? Do we know where we make them?
Where?
Yeah. Where in the body? What is it?
Blood vessels.
Not blood vessels. Your bone marrow.
Oh,
The
yeah.
center of your long bone. So the center of your femur, the center of your humerus, the center of your long bones is where you're making new blood vessels or new blood cells, sorry. And they're getting into your circulation every single day. When the red blood cells are done being useful, right, when they're no longer good at carrying oxygen anymore, they are taken apart, and your body's really good about recycling parts, right? So either your liver, your spleen, or your red bone marrow, you have these white blood cells that chew up the red blood cells that are not very efficient anymore, and they actually take apart the hemoglobin and the iron, right, and the different components, because you can reuse those. And so only about 10% of red blood cells rupture in the bloodstream. Most red blood cells are actually taken apart either in the liver, the spleen, or the red bone marrow. So the globular proteins are broken into amino acids, which your body reuses. The iron is extracted, right? and the remaining heme is converted to biliverdin, which is converted to bilirubin, which your liver absorbs and then gets rid of through your intestines. There is a condition where the bilirubin can build up and it causes jaundice. Jaundice is yellowish skin and eyes, and it's just a sign of excessive bilirubin levels in your blood. It's the result usually of blocked bile ducts. So sometimes if somebody has gallstones, that's blocking the bile duct, or the failure of your liver to absorb and excrete bilirubin. That's what happens in infants sometimes, is that their liver isn't functioning to its ability yet. And so it's actually not absorbing and excreting the bilirubin. Bilirubin just starts building up in the bloodstream, right? So many infants are born and have jaundice, and within a couple of days, they're okay. They just have to be monitored for a couple of days. So this just shows the recycling of hemoglobin. Again, here's new red blood cell formation, right? Macrophages in the spleen, the liver, and the red bone marrow can pick apart these red blood cells when they're no longer circulating very well anymore. They send the iron back to the bone. They send the bilirubin to the liver, right, which gets it into the intestine, which eventually sends it to the kidney so that you can get rid of it and get it out of your body. Gender and iron reserves. They talk about the fact that men have about 3.5 grams of iron, where women have about 2.4. So women naturally have less iron in their body than men, which makes women more susceptible to anemia. If they don't have as much iron, you can't find as much oxygen. So more often women require the dietary supplement of iron than men do. Red blood cell formation is called erythropoiesis. Red blood cells themselves are erythrocytes. And during the first 8 weeks of development, so this is when you're in the womb, the red blood cell formation happens through the yolk sac, which is adjacent to the placenta. In adults, it occurs in your red bone marrow, right? And it requires different amino acids, iron and vitamins, in order to make new red blood cells. We're doing this every single day. And then the red blood cells have to mature. And as they mature, as they get from these immature cells, these hemocytoblasts, into becoming erythroblasts and erythrocytes, they actually kick out a lot of the organelles, right, to make room for more hemoglobin and for more binding of oxygen. And so here you can see, here is a hemopoietic stem cell. So this is a stem cell that would be in your bone marrow. And stem cells are cells which haven't received all the signals yet to become a certain type of cell. So this stem cell is going to become a blood cell, but it still has to get more signals to go down one of these pathways. Now, the signals might lead it to be a red blood cell, which is this first pathway. The signals might lead it to be a platelet, which is the second pathway, or it may be one of these different types of white blood cells. There are 5 different types of white blood cells. So in your bone marrow, you have these immature cells, and depending on what the signals are that they receive, they can become any of these different types of blood cells. So one of the ways that this is regulated is through a hormone called EPO, erythropoietin. It's stimulated by low tissue oxygen. So you're constantly monitoring. Your kidneys are constantly monitoring how much oxygen is in your blood. If your kidneys notice that the oxygen levels are low, they respond by sending a signal back to the bone marrow telling the bone marrow to make more red blood cells, make more than you're doing, right? It's a natural reaction. Your body is saying, okay, I don't have enough oxygen. If I have more red blood cells, I can have more oxygen. So your kidney sends this signal back to your bone marrow, and your bone marrow starts making more red blood cells. Now, if you go up high in altitude to the top of a mountain, is there more oxygen or less oxygen?
Less oxygen?
Less oxygen,
Mhm.
right? So we've probably all heard of different athletes going to high elevations to train, right? Boxers are famous for that. They go to high elevations and have a training camp at a high elevation. What that does is it triggers the body to make more of this hormone to make more red blood cells. What's happening at that high elevation is your body is recognizing that it doesn't have enough oxygen. And so its response is, okay, well, let's make more red blood cells. The advantage is that when that athlete comes back down towards sea level, they are carrying more red blood cells than their opponent, hopefully, right? So they can actually get more oxygen around their body than their opponent. They'll have more endurance, right? They won't get fatigued as easily. Now, if your opponent also trains at a high altitude, then it doesn't really matter, right? Kind of cancels each other out. That's what a lot of endurance athletes are doing when they train at high elevations. Now, there is a synthetic form of EPO, right? It's made for people who are very sick with, diseases like cancer, where they can't make enough blood cells. There are people who abuse that. Notoriously cyclists, right? If you hear about Lance Armstrong or any of the cyclists, I shouldn't say any, but a lot of the cyclists in the Tour de France, you hear about blood doping. And this is what they're doing, right? They are using the synthetic form of this hormone to make more red blood cells. The thought is, if you have more red blood cells than your opponents, then you'll have more endurance than your opponents. You'll be carrying more oxygen around your body than your opponents, right? And that's what they're doing. That's what blood doping is. And when you hear EPO, that's what they're talking about. It's using a synthetic form of this hormone in order to raise their levels of red blood cells. The danger of that is that sometimes if you have too many red blood cells, your blood becomes really thick, really viscous, and it's hard to get that blood through your arteries and veins. So what I want to do, since I don't know if you guys saw that, it looked like we were going to get kicked off in a few minutes. I will just log off and log back on, and we'll do a little bit more about ABO. Okay. So I'm going to log off real quick, and then I'm just going to log back on with the same link, and we'll go through the ABO blood typing system.